I do want to point out how Rabbi Singer's skepticism towards the resurrection, if taken to its logical conclusion, would undermine Judaism as well. In other words, we have a case of when Jews argue like atheists.
As it turns out, we're going to explore a Roman Catholic apologist. His name is Trent Horn. He's a conservative Roman Catholic. And he's not like the ultra-traditionalists, like the sedevacantists who, like, we talked about people like that, like the Mel Gibson type, who sedevacantist means that there are some Catholics who do not believe that the popes today, whether it's Leo the 14th or his predecessor, are valid, and known as Pius XII as a valid pope. Sedevacantist means the seat is empty. Those folks tend to be very anti-Jewish, and he's not that at all. He's not that at all. And he's a nice fellow. He's a nice fellow. And I say he's a nice fellow, and I comment on that when addressing apologists and people who want to convert the world, is because this whole world of missionaries attracts really some very unsavory characters who, troll me, and many of them are just out of their minds. He's not that. He seems to be a nice fellow. I've never met him, but he appears to be a nice fellow. And as I said, he's a conservative Roman Catholic, and he took objection to the many interviews we've done over the years, where I showed that the Messiah is not supposed to die and resurrect from the dead, and that what we encounter in the Christian Bible, particularly the Passion narratives, they're not quite credible.
So Tovia Singer has been engaging Christian apologists for some time now, but he does so from a Jewish perspective, as a rabbi. But I think that the topic of the resurrection is one of the most effective to discuss with a Jewish apologist. That's because it can be really easy to get bogged down in the question of whether Jesus fulfilled specific messianic prophecies, such as you end up focusing on small details in biblical Hebrew or the interpretive traditions in the Talmud and things like that. However, if Jesus Christ did rise from the dead, then almost everyone would agree that this would vindicate not only his claims to divinity, but he and his followers' claims of him being the Messiah. Now, I'm not going to address every argument Rabbi Singer has raised against Jesus' resurrection, but I do want to point out how Rabbi Singer's skepticism towards the resurrection, if taken to its logical conclusion, would undermine Judaism as well. In other words, we have a case of when Jews argue like atheists.
That's his line, where I think he has a book he's written on topic when Protestants argue like atheists, and I think he's applying that to me. But nothing, of course, could be further from the truth. As it turns out, the monumental problem of the claim that Jesus died as the Messiah and rose from the dead is not any contradiction at all, but rather it's that the Messiah is not supposed to die and resurrect from the dead. That's the chief problem. So therefore, I'm not arguing like an atheist. There's nothing to be further from the truth. Moreover, in the Hebrew Bible, there are many people who have been resurrected from the dead by Elijah and Elisha, his disciple. Doesn't make these people the Messiah. The Messiah is not supposed to do any of those things. Moreover, in the Hebrew Scriptures, we are told explicitly that false religions are able to do miracles. Parshas Re'eh, Deuteronomy chapter 13, we're told that if a prophet or dream is able to do perform any sort of sign or wonder, and it comes to pass. Do not listen to that prophet or dream of dreams. I didn't send him, saith the Lord. I am only testing you to see if you love me. So what the text is saying is, follow the book. In fact, it's in the beginning of that chapter in the Hebrew Bible where it talks about don't add to the Torah nor take away from it. as we find in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 2. So the key reason why Christianity is opposed by the Jewish faith is because its teachings are incompatible with Judaism. We find, as an example, in the events surrounding the Exodus, that as it turns out, the Egyptian magicians were able to replicate many of the miracles that Moses and Aaron were able to perform. That doesn't mean that I should convert to the gods of Pharaoh. So that's very key here. In classical Jewish thought, which is based on the scripture, that false religions can perform miracles. Now, I'm not going to go into why, but in our time, this is not happening. That means in our time, the putative miracles we're told about visions of Mary and visions of Hanuman, the monkey god in Hinduism, it's all, in my view, complete nonsense, chicanery, self-delusion or mass delusion or whatever it is. The Tanakh is not that sardonic. In the view of the Hebrew Bible, false religions could produce any sort of miracle, but the question is, are the ideas and teachings of this religion, of this prophet who's coming to you in your dreams, Jeremiah chapter 29, coming to your dreams, is it compatible with the Hebrew Bible? And at its core, the raw teachings of the church are opposed by the Jewish scriptures. That's why Judaism rejects the Christian Messiah. It's not personal. We're not against Trent Horn. We're not against the Pope. We're not against Paul. We're just very much, if we have to choose between Moses and Paul, we know to go with Moses every time. And it's very much like I often share, like, why did God create Mormons? So Christians would know how Jews feel. I mean, why don't you join the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? After all, did not Joseph Smith on September 21st, 1823, encounter the angel Moroni? Well, that's, and there's a number of witnesses to this. So the answer is you're not persuaded by this. Joseph Smith, perhaps chicanery, perhaps self-delusion. It doesn't matter. The point is, it's just inconsistent with the Bible.
For example, one way that Rabbi Singer argues against the resurrection is by pointing out alleged contradictions between the gospel accounts. Here's an example.
Are so incompatible because they're just different stories. Matthew's resurrection story begins in Matthew 28, the last chapter. We are told that early in the morning, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary come to the tomb early Sunday morning. There's an earthquake, an angel rolls away the stone from the front of the tomb. So by the time the women encounter the disciples, they know everything. They know everything because the angel, the man that rolled away the stone, informed them that Jesus isn't there and he has already risen. He's gone before the Galilee, and there you will see him. And they have it directly on word from Jesus, who repeats essentially the same exact story. They are thoroughly convinced.
So according to Rabbi Singer, Matthew's gospel shows Mary Magdalene learning immediately at Jesus' tomb from an angel that he rose from the dead. And this happened before she met the disciples.
What I'm very interested in is John. And here, we only have to deal with the first two passages of John chapter 20. It's the first day of the week. Mary Magdalene came early. It was still dark. And she arrives at the tomb, and she already sees that the stone had been taken away from the front of the tomb. There's no angel there to inform her anything. She runs back and goes to Simon Peter and the other disciple, who Jesus loved, meaning John, and said to them, they took the Lord's body out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have laid him. So she comes to the tomb, there's nothing there. In contrast to Matthew, there's no angel there. There's no instructions there. She has no clue where he is. And as far as she's concerned, Jesus' body was taken away.
So to summarize, Singer says John only shows Mary Magdalene learning Jesus rose from the dead much later, after she met the disciples.
When Mary encounters Jesus for the first time, does she know that, did she have the information that Jesus rose from the dead or not? Does she know what happened or not? According to Matthew, she definitely knows. By the time Mary meets the disciples for the first time, Sunday morning, Easter morning, does she know or does she not know that Jesus rose from the dead? I mean, this is not just a piece of information. This is the whole story. This is the whole point. This is like everything. This is about, do you know that Jesus rose from the dead? That's everything.
First, let's say this was a contradiction. At most, all that would prove is that there is a contradiction between the two accounts involving Mary Magdalene. Not that the accounts are worthless or that we shouldn't believe in the resurrection. The evidence for the resurrection primarily comes from the fact that Jesus died and his followers sincerely believed he was alive again, and there's no good natural explanation for their belief in his resurrection. They didn't hallucinate that he rose from the dead, for example, because this does not conform to what we know about hallucinations, especially those involving multiple people you can't share the same hallucination, and the fact that the disciples could have checked Jesus' empty tomb to confirm if they were hallucinating a resurrection or if it genuinely happened. Now, our earliest source for Jesus' disciples that they claim to see the risen Lord, it doesn't come from the Gospels. It comes from the witnesses described in 1 Corinthians 15. So already you have the bedrock evidence for the Christian faith apart from these elements of the gospel narratives. You can also appeal to the Gospels that don't contain this alleged contradiction, like what we find in Luke's Gospel, for example.
So, as it turns out, if, let's say, there were only one Gospel, for example, Irenaeus, who was the Bishop of Lyon in the late 2nd century, he assigns that there's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're the 4 Gospels that are the canon, okay? Let's say he only chose one, so there were no contradictions. Would that make Christianity true? Far from it. Again, the reason why these core claims of the church are false is because the ideas that are advanced are utterly opposed by the Hebrew Bible. There's nothing about the Messiah coming twice. In fact, that is the red flag of a false religion. Moreover, another point. What Trent is doing here, he's conflating variants with contradictions. There are many variants in Tanakh. There are. It was King David the youngest of 7 brothers, or was he the youngest of 8 brothers? Okay. Well, it depends. It depends if you're relying on Samuel or you're relying on Chronicles. That's a variant, but there's a very easy solution to that. I'm not going to go into that now. You have a lot of that in Tanakh, and lahavdil, you have many examples of that in the Christian Bible, and there are very easy solutions to this. For example, what was of no interest to me at all is that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the 4 Gospels, where toward the end we find the Passion narratives, we are told a different number of women that show up to the tomb. So in Matthew, you have only 2 women that come to the tomb. In Mark, you have 3. In Luke, there are more than 4. And John, there's only 1. Okay? That is a variant. That's not a contradiction. Don't use that when talking to Christians. It's silly. They have answers to it. Now, do you buy their answers? That's a different question, but that's not a contradiction. There are many such. I actually chart this out in Volume 1 of Let's Get Biblical. They're loaded with variants. The problem is when you have contradictions. Contradictions are just not reconcilable. Now, what Trent has made a statement, which is this wrong, is that he said we have eyewitness accounts, and were they hallucinating? We don't have eyewitness accounts. And so I think he's a nice person. I don't want to cast aspersion on his character in any way, but that's a kind of sleight of hand. It means the Gospels are not eyewitness accounts. Now, you may believe that on faith. You may believe that Matthew and John were written by the tax collector, Matthew Levi, and John, the son of Zebedee, for the fourth gospel. You can believe that if you want to, but there's nothing in the text that would indicate that. There's no reason to believe that. You can believe that the second century church father, the Bishop of Lyon, when he assigned the first gospel to Matthew and the fourth gospel to John, you can believe it on faith, but you can't claim that as an apologetic. So he said we have eyewitnesses, and then said, well, you can't say this is a mass hallucination but the premise is flawed, is utterly flawed. The book of Matthew doesn't indicate that Matthew wrote it. There's nowhere in the book of Matthew where the author identifies himself as the author of Matthew. In fact, he refers to Matthew in the third person, and the only place Matthew is mentioned in the first gospel, Matthew chapter 9, verse 9. Now, if somewhere in the book it identified the author as Matthew, so then the third person use in Matthew 9:9 could just simply be assigned to some sort of literary technique. But it's not. There's no reason to believe. There's no evidence. There's nothing. Zero reason to believe that Matthew, who is portrayed as a disciple, is the author of the first gospel, and that John, the son of Zebedee, was the author of the fourth gospel. So you don't have that. So this is, again, nothing against Trent, nothing personal, but this is, because you're going to hear apologists say this all the time, and they go, well, was there a mass hallucination? There's no claim. That means the premise is completely flawed, it's completely shattered, and it gets even worse, because Trent then says, but we have an earlier source for Jesus' resurrection, and that's 1 Corinthians 15. And he called it an eyewitness account. Well, that's mind-blowing, because that's even worse. Why? So it is true. The only thing true about that is 1 Corinthians, one of the indisputed letters of Paul, is earlier than the Gospels. The 1 Corinthians was written somewhere in the mid-50s, right? The Gospels are written, let's say Matthew was written, and Luke were written in the 80s, as an example, John a little later. So it is earlier. That part is correct. Everything else is flawed. 1 Corinthians is not written by an eyewitness, but it gets even worse than that. That is at the time of Jesus' putative crucifixion and supposed resurrection, the author of 1 Corinthians didn't even believe in Jesus. So not only wasn't he an eyewitness, he didn't even believe this. Moreover, nowhere in 1 Corinthians 15, perhaps the most famous chapter of Paul, does it state that there was an empty tomb. I know it sounds crazy, but it's not there. It is there that Jesus rose from the dead, and Paul is claiming that Jesus appeared to a whole series of people, Peter and so on, but Paul wasn't an eyewitness to the crucifixion and resurrection. Paul's going to claim later that Jesus appeared to him in a special revelation, and I believe that as much as I believe Joseph Smith encountered the angel Moroni in upstate New York in the early 19th century. It's completely fatuous. It's completely silly. Moreover, these central features or figures in the passion narratives we find in the Gospels are utterly absent in 1 Corinthians 15. Where are these women in 1 Corinthians 15? They're not there. And Paul, right from the get-go, enumerates for us who Jesus appeared to. Well, guess what? Mary Magdalene isn't there. The other Mary isn't there. They're just not there. So we don't find support for the gospel stories in 1 Corinthians 15, and it's certainly not an eyewitness account. Paul can't be an eyewitness to the resurrection because he didn't believe in Jesus at the time. So again, I want to be very clear about this. This is not about Trent Horn's character. I am sure he's a nice fellow. This stuff is just repeated, and just repeated, and just people just keep regurgitating it. There's no claim of an eyewitness account. Paul is not an eyewitness to the resurrection of Jesus at the time of the crucifixion. Paul wasn't even a Christian at the time. We're told that Paul persecuted Christians in the early part of his life. Whether that's true or not, Paul was a guy who was hard to get along with, so it's quite likely he didn't get along with people. You'd have to leave that alone. Let's go back to the other part of this, which I think is very critical. And that's, we're picking off on the issue of variance and actual contradictions, where the contradiction displays that the whole story is completely convoluted. It's made up. We are not interested in variance. It is true. The lies that gain traction are those lies that have a little bit of truth to it. So there is a little truth to the fact that we have variance in Tanakh. But what we're dealing with here is an utter contradiction, which means that the two stories are completely different on a fundamental level. First of all, according to the Gospels, according to Mark and Luke as an example, you'd have to go just to the last chapter of each of these books, meaning the second and third Gospel. Mary comes to the tomb in order to anoint the body on Sunday morning. That was the reason why they came there. Why would they anoint a corpse that's been rotting in a grave for 3 days? No one does that. Women wouldn't be performing a tahira, the ritual on a dead body of a man. That just would never happen. Okay. Now, I don't want to go off on that too much. They're not coming there to put flowers by the tomb where they feel utterly grief-stricken. It's very specific. They couldn't do it before Sabbath. They come back after Sabbath. Why would you put spices with a body that's already? Why? It's not that it doesn't make sense. The whole point of putting spices with the body is when the body has not yet been buried, in order so that the body doesn't smell, not to cause a bezoin hamesh, a disgrace to the dead. So it's very clear these stories are completely convoluted. Moreover, the contradiction in the stories further displays that these stories are just made up. The example he chose, which is from various interviews we've done, William, is according to Matthew's resurrection account, which begins in Matthew 28, the last chapter. We're told that Mary Magdalene and the other Mary come to the tomb early Sunday morning, and there was an earthquake. An angel came and sat on the stone and immediately informs the women that Jesus rose from the dead. He's gone ahead to Galilee. There you will see him. Let everybody know. Let everyone, okay? So the women know the whole deal. They're informed. On the way back to speak to the disciples, guess who they meet on the way? Jesus himself. And they grab hold of him and they worship him, okay? And Jesus essentially repeats the same story again, okay? Then she goes to the disciples. Well, that doesn't work with John, because according to John chapter 20, the second to the last chapter of the fourth gospel, Mary Magdalene alone. That's not an issue that she's alone, okay? That's just a variant. Mary Magdalene comes to the tomb, it's empty, she doesn't know what to do, okay? The key point is that she sees that there are two angels inside the tomb. Again, I don't want to talk about one or two, where they are on the stone. That's a variant, not important to us. What is important is the angels ask Mary, why are you crying? Okay, and she's, they don't tell him they don't tell her anything that Jesus rose in Galilee, none of that stuff. She says, they have taken away the Lord's body, and, do you know where it is? Like, where is he? Like, what happened to him? Okay. She then turns around and she sees a fellow who she thinks is the gardener. I mean, she doesn't recognize him as Jesus. And ultimately, she asks Jesus, who she thinks is a worker, do you know where Jesus' body is? And Jesus then says, Mary, and she says, Rabboni, and bingo. Okay, that's very different. So when Mary meets Jesus for the first time, she has no idea that Jesus rose from the dead, and actually asks Jesus himself, did you? Because the angels didn't tell her anything. Okay, so that's a contradiction. Those two cannot survive together. what is even more stunning in the contradictions, which I think is even more telling, is the day in which the crucifixion occurred according to the Synoptic Gospels versus the book of John. In the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus is crucified on the first day of Passover, and therefore the Passover Seder, or let's change that to the Last Supper, is the Passover Seder, and all the accoutrements of a Passover Seder are present. And that's why the Eucharist takes place at the Last Supper in the Synoptic Gospels. Synoptic Gospels mean the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In the book of John, the Last Supper is not a Passover Seder because in John's view, Jesus was crucified on the 14th day of Nisan, which means the eve of Passover, and therefore at the Last Supper, there's no Last Supper. There's no bread, there's no wine. Rather, we have a unique story where Jesus is washing the feet of the disciples in John chapter 13. If you want to find the Eucharist in the book of John, do not look for it in the Last Supper, where you'd find it in the Synoptic Gospels, but rather you'd find it in John chapter 6, verse 55 and 56. Those are massive contradictions. They are not variants. I think also it should be stated that for Christians to say, well, there are also contradictions in Tanakh, is really an argument, a fallacy of tu quoque. It's a fallacy. Tu quoque means essentially you too. It means you're not answering the question. The question is, why don't you do your taxes? That's the question. Why didn't you file your taxes? Okay. Well, if your answer is you didn't file your taxes either, that doesn't answer the question. It's a version of, it's a fallacy. It's an ad hominem fallacy, but it doesn't even begin to answer the question. I would just say this, incidentally, that argument, I think, degrades the Christian. Like, I would never, it's just blasphemy for a person who's a religious person to ever say, well, you have contradiction Tanakh too, so therefore it could be dispensed with. I think it's wrong to say that, but I want to just set that aside. I want to ignore that because maybe he's saying it's the same standard. I don't think it's a sacred way to approach this, but it doesn't answer the question. So it becomes a device rather than a thoughtful answer. If Christians want to try to figure out how John disagrees with the Synoptic Gospel on the day in which Jesus was crucified, knock yourself out. You're not going to be able to do it. It's very clear that the Jews won't enter the praetorium of Pontius Pilate because they don't want to become defiled because they're going to eat from the Passover lamb. That can't work. None of this works. So now those are problems. To go say, well, there are variants in Tanakh, that's not going to help you. So that's a fallacy that really will not rescue Christians. But the key point is always this. There is nothing anywhere in Hebrew Bible where we're told that the Messiah is going to come twice. This is nothing like that. And nothing like he did some things but didn't do others, because all the things he supposedly did are things that we would have no access to. They're unfalsifiable. Was Jesus born of a virgin in Bethlehem? Well, we have no way of checking that. All the things that the Messiah is supposed to do, if he had done any of those things, we would know about it today.
The evidence for the resurrection is so good that one Jewish scholar has accepted that Jesus rose from the dead, but he still does not believe Jesus is the Messiah. That scholar is Pinhas Lapid, who says in his book, The Resurrection of Jesus, A Jewish Perspective, he writes the following: if the defeated and depressed group of disciples overnight could change into a victorious movement of faith based only on autosuggestion or self-deception, without a fundamental faith experience, then this would be a much greater miracle than the resurrection itself. Lapid does not believe that Jesus is the Messiah, though, because he doesn't think that Jesus truly brought the kingdom of God into the world, or he failed to fulfill messianic prophecy. But this makes a premature judgment based solely on Christ's first coming. Christians have long held that the Old Testament describes the Messiah coming twice, once as a suffering and rejected servant, as described in Isaiah 53, and a second time as a liberating king, as described in Isaiah 11. Just because Jesus has not fulfilled prophecies about world peace or the conquering of death we see in Isaiah 11 and 25, that doesn't mean Jesus is not the Messiah. He can still fulfill those prophecies at his second coming. There were even Jews from before the time of Christ who believed in two comings of the Messiah, but for them, they thought it involved two different Messiahs. The original Hebrew text of Zechariah 6:11, for example, refers to crowns in the plural being made for the king and priest involved in building the temple.
If you engage with Christian apologists, you're going to hear Pinhas Lapid come up a lot. He was an oddball. He's dead. He cannot defend himself, but he was an apologist for the church. And what I mean was he was not a Christian, but he was an oddball. He's an outlier. He was an Israeli diplomat that served at the Council of Milan and basically devoted his entire life to trying to find some ecumenical, brotherly way of Jews and Christians getting along, and basically we can find some, happy medium. He also was instrumental in trying to achieve good relations between the Jews or the State of Israel and the Vatican, which at the time, when he certainly served the Council of Milan, did not have diplomatic relations. He was definitely an apologist of Pius XII following World War II. Of course, the scandal that the Vatican had diplomatic relations with Nazi Germany, that Pius XII did nothing to save the Jews. Hitler's Pope was a big problem. So Lapid was the guy who was trying to find, Pius XII was a good guy and so on. He's an outlier. So he came up with this kind of stuff that there could have been a resurrection. He doesn't believe in Jesus the Messiah, but maybe Jesus was the Messiah for the Gentiles. So this is, this is an appeal to somebody who his whole life was trying to figure out a way where everybody could sit around the campfire. And it's silly. It would be as silly as for me to prove that Jesus didn't rise from the dead by saying that, well, look, Bishop Shelby Spong, who wrote more books than Lapid, he was a Christian, he was an Episcopalian priest, a bishop, didn't believe that Jesus rose from the dead and thought that that Paul was a homosexual, and a lot of other things that would be very offensive. That wouldn't shake any Christian's faith, that I can bring up examples of Christians who did not believe in the core tenets of the Christian religion because they're outliers. They just had very odd views, and that's not relevant. Okay, so, and as it turns out, for years, Christians just use Pinhas Lapid, who his work was to try to tell Christians those things he could possibly say that could make them feel good and we're all getting along. That's all very silly. And then he comes with the idea of a second coming is in Tanakh. It's not in Tanakh. In fact, Paul brags that he has a unique revelation and a mystery that he's revealing the second coming. Paul is specifically saying in Ephesians chapter 3 that he has access to a revelation from Jesus that no one knows about. And here is the knowledge. It's really this is very much like a Gnostic idea. And Paul, in fact, admits in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 7 and 8, he says that if the generation that killed Jesus would have known about this mystery that I have the answer to, they would have never crucified the Lord of glory, his words. So Paul is admitting this is something new. It's non-Tanakh. Moreover, what Trent is bringing up in Zechariah chapter 6 is really quite silly. We are told explicitly that there are two crowns that are made from the offering of three Jews who come from Babylon to bring gifts. One of them, his name is Tovia. It's one of the rare cases in Tanakh where the name Tovia appears in Zechariah chapter 6. We are told explicitly that one crown was for the high priest, whose name was Yehoshua, but it's not the Yeshua of Christianity. It's Yehoshua ben Yehotzadok. That's the nephew of Ezra. Okay, Yehotzadok was Ezra's younger brother. The other one was for Zerubbabel, and he's the one who builds the temple, the second temple. It means we're told Yehoshua ben Yehotzadok, the son of, I don't know how they say it in the English Bible, but it's ben Yehotzadok. We're told that name explicitly. The two core central figures that build the second temple are, one, the nephew of Ezra, his name again is Yoshua ben Yehotzadok, and Zerubbabel, who was born in Babylon, and he serves as a governor. He's not a king, he serves as a governor, but he's from the house of David. And those two figures, deeply religious individuals, are the two massive figures that come from Babylon, come back to the land of Israel to rebuild the temple. Ezra is going to join later on. He's still back with his teacher, Baruch ben Uriah. I don't want to go off topic. If you read Zechariah 6, verse 13, now these are the passages that Trent quoted, which is mind-blowing. It tells us that, in fact, that there'll be a crown on one and a crown on the other. Each one will sit on his throne. Va'atza sholem tia bein shnehem. There'll be a council of peace between the both of them. That means it's two different individuals. It means even if you want to say that although the context of Zechariah chapter 6 is talking about Yoshua ben Yehotzadok, Joshua the son of Yehotzadok, again, nephew of Ezra, and Zerubbabel, but somehow this is a portent of the Messianic age in the future, if you want to even say that, which now Christians will never articulate it that way because it seems torturous, but you're welcome to do that. That means I want to steel man. I want to make this. If you do that, then you're making the problem even worse. Remember what I always tell you, what Mark Twain said, that, when you tell the truth, you don't have to be very clever, because once you lie, you essentially have to be a genius because you have to keep track of everything. Once you change what's going on and say, well, this is really talking about the end times, and this is talking about the Messiah at the end of days, you now have a bigger problem, because we are told that there will be a high priest and the king who will build the temple, and there will be a Atza Shalom, there will be a council of peace between them. It means they're going to get along. In Jewish history, there were times where kings and priests didn't get along. Sometimes they got along terribly. Sometimes there were kings that killed priests. We're going to ignore that. The point is, they're going to get along. Well, are we talking about a Messiah who has multiple personality disorder? Like, what does that mean? That means the text itself screams that these are two different individuals rather than a second coming. The second coming is a promiscuous excuse for a failed Messiah. You need a second coming when the person you think is Messiah doesn't do anything. So therefore you say, well, there's a second coming. Well, if there's a second coming, then my sister-in-law could be the Messiah. She didn't do anything, second coming. It's not in Tanakh. If you enjoyed this program, please like and subscribe.
אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא ואת נעשה בחפצו כל